Joining me now is the Manager of Opposition Business and the Shadow Minister for Industrial Relations, Tony Burke. Thanks so much for joining us. Very good morning to you. Can we just go through some of these tests the Prime Minister's setting for Labor, perhaps starting with drug testing New Start recipients? What do you think of that?
Yeah, well, I'll get to that, but first of all, doesn't it say it all that we've got a Prime Minister who's only determined to work out what fights he can pick rather than having a plan for jobs? Now, if you're one of the Australians who has had their job lost over the last week, and there's been stories during the week from Virgin to a series of major employers where people are losing their jobs, none of that features in Scott Morrison's speech. None of that makes it at all. So you want to work through the list? Let's work through the list. But the key thing that all of these issues have in common, none of them are a plan for the economy. None of them deliver for jobs. None of them deal with the fact that people have seen their wages flatline under this government. But I'm happy to work through the list with you.
All right. Well, so you're saying these are trivial matters?
None of them go to the biggest issues that the economy is facing right now. Yeah, if you're someone who's just had it announced that your job's on the line, or you're somebody who just hasn't had a real pay increase for years now, you've got to wonder what on earth this Prime Minister's about. Yeah, at the election he got his own job secured and now thinks he can put his feet up and not care about anyone else's job. Yeah, there are real issues in the Australian economy here.
Let's work through the list, as you put it. Drug testing New Start recipients, then. What do you think of this idea of a trial of drug testing?
Okay. First thing to know, the biggest age bracket of New Start recipients are the over 55s. They've increased as a group by 45% over the last 5 years. So the people who Scott Morrison is talking about are the people who've worked their lives, lost their jobs, and he now wants them to humiliate themselves, walking into the office, having to urinate into a cup, having pieces of their hair plucked out, having to spit into a jar. And all of this for what? Because he thinks it's a clever political battle with Labor. It won't create a job. It humiliates people. It's not a sensible policy.
If it applied only to those under 55, would that make a difference?
Well, yeah, you talk about somebody who's a mum who loses her job, you know, a little bit under that age. You know, is this really what we want to be able to deal with? Like, I've just got to say, it's not simply that in terms of a policy it's been tested overseas and failed, and it has been tested and it has failed. It's also the case that you don't create a job out of this. Yeah, it's like there's no economic headwinds to worry about. As long as he gets the rhetoric right, this Prime Minister thinks everything else will follow. So you've got a policy they want to put forward that's been tested and failed. You've got that as a problem. But the bigger problem with all of this is what they're ignoring.
All right, we'll come to the economy, but just going through what will be before Parliament, rolling out the cashless welfare card to more trial sites. The government's talked about all of the Northern Territory and Cape York being the next areas it wants to trial this in. What do you think about that?
Well, can I say they've also added Bankstown on the list that's in the papers today, which is the suburb next to me. I live in Punchbowl. Let me tell you a really quick local example as to how this cashless debit card creates real problems. We already know all the challenges about the money provided through New Start not being enough for people to be able to make ends meet. Suburbs like mine, the corner stores, the little small businesses, fruit and veggie shops, butchers, massively undercut the major supermarkets on a whole range of items. But the cashless debit card says you can only go to those who've signed up. So what does it mean? It means the government will be forcing people away from small businesses to buy products at a higher price, to make it harder for people to make ends meet. Now, that's the example I know well because it's where I live. We're not alone in that. Those sorts of examples will be found with people who are not part of this system and retailers that are not part of it, more likely to be small businesses. So they punish the small businesses and they make cost of living even more difficult for the exact group of people who have more cost of living challenges than any other Australians.
OK, well, the government says there are some early signs of success in sites where this has been trialled so far. Just to be clear, you're saying you will not support any further expansion of this?
Well, I'll leave it to Linda Burney for the final announcement. But yeah, it's pretty clear where we're headed on this. In terms of the government saying, in terms of the government saying that there's signs that it's worked, I'd say they ought to have a look at what the Auditor General's had to say. The Auditor General has been deeply critical of claims that this program is working.
Now, on mandatory sentencing of pedophiles, Christian Porter's put forward this bill. Will Labor support it, or do you want to protect the judicial discretion here over sentencing?
Well, we supported it in the House of Representatives. We made clear we'd support it through there. There was a Senate inquiry process to work out exactly what had happened with respect to amendments. I've got to say, to put this one forward as a cynical ploy rates among the most offensive things I've seen in my time in politics.
Why do you say it's a cynical ploy?
Have a think about this. You've got legislation coming off the back of the Royal Commission into child sexual abuse, a Royal Commission that was the last act performed, putting that into place, the last action by Julia Gillard as Prime Minister. And even though it took a while at the time for the then opposition to come on board, it ended up having bipartisan support. The government have then taken recommendations out of that and have wanted to add something that they know as a matter of principle. Labor has had a long-standing view that you actually get better punishments and more convictions of people if you have maximum sentencing rather than mandatory. So they've wanted to throw this in to turn child sexual abuse into a political game. Now, you know, the gravity of that...
OK, let me jump in there, because Christian Porter says... He points to the figures. He says there's been a huge increase in the Commonwealth offences we're talking about here, whether it's abusing kids in other countries or whether it's online paedophilia. And he says about a third of convictions don't see the offender spend one day behind bars. Isn't that evidence that there needs to be some tougher approach?
Oh, and there are a series of ways of making tougher approaches, but there's a series of ways they've been dealt with at state levels in different ways. You can increase maximums. There's a series of things that can be done there. The issue with mandatory sentencing, and we're going to end up having to face both issues in a single vote. That's where this will end up. And in terms of the gravity of it, the gravity of making sure that we fully combat child sexual abuse, I think makes clear as to how we would end up dealing with that when you've got both issues that you've got to deal with at once, as we voted.
So you'd have to bite the bullet and back this in?
Well, when you're faced with a single vote involving something you support and something where you think it could be done better, you have to deal with the questions that are in front of you. We faced exactly that in the House of Representatives and we voted in favour. But to turn that really into some sort of so-called test for Labor, because the stats that you said that Christian Porter quoted don't deal with the principal problem, which is under this sort of scenario, yes, when you get convictions, you may find that you get higher sentences. You also will often have juries failing to convict if they
because judges or juries may not want that offender to receive the mandatory sentence, so they won't convict. Is that your view?
That's what some of the evidence has said, and that's why previously we've preferred a maximum sentence approach than a mandatory sentence approach. But we don't in that case, when we've put those arguments, ever said this is a test for the coalition as to whether or not they're really opposed to paedophilia. I mean, what has Australian politics become when every issue, even child sexual abuse, is something that the Liberal Party see as political opportunity? I mean, what have they become? Every time you hear a Liberal minister open a policy with this is a test for Labor, you know that their prime objective is the politics and not the Australian people.
Well, let's turn to the economy then, where you say the government should be more focused. Do you think the economy needs higher taxes or lower taxes right now?
Oh, the lower taxes right now, we supported in the Parliament. We campaigned for them at the election, and they will go some way towards doing some of the things that the Governor of the Reserve Bank's been saying the Australian economy needs. That's why we voted for them. That's why we campaigned for them. They were tax cuts for lower and middle income earners. We wanted them right now. We needed them right now. We voted for them right now. They don't do all the job that the Governor of the Reserve Bank's demanding, but they go some way towards it.
But does Labor still believe in the higher taxes you took to the election?
All those policies are under review, and you know that that's been the case and was made clear from the moment Anthony Albanese became leader.
Wayne Swan, though, the federal president of the ALP's, jumped in before that review's complete, saying he thinks this is an agenda Labor should be proud of, not resile from these tax measures. Do you agree?
Oh, and as president of the party, you know, Wayne's no longer a member of Parliament. He can put that view. As part of policies being under review, people will put different views. But, you know, there's a formal review in place at the moment. There's a formal review in place at the moment, David, and I'm not going to get ahead of that because, you know, one of the dangers after an election defeat is you can fall into the trap of thinking the party that lost got everything wrong and the party that won got everything right. And whenever there's an election like this, you don't have to just make sure you've heard the message and you've learnt the lessons. You've got to make sure you learn the right lessons from it. That's the reason for the review. You know, the time for
no, and I appreciate it's still under review, but just
Australian people.
Just in principle, when you look at the economy right now, is now the time for increasing taxes, albeit on high-income earners and investors and so on?
Oh, what we need right now are the tax cuts which we voted for. The other thing that we need right now is for some of the infrastructure projects that the government promised, but then when you look at the books, you know, they've got to win 2 more elections or something before people even dig a hole. Some of these can be brought forward. Sure, there's some major infrastructure projects, some of the really big ones where there's a whole slow planning process that has to go into place. But there are other projects that are shovel-ready now, that create jobs now, that improve our infrastructure now. What's the reason that Scott Morrison won't bring those projects forward, even though the Governor of the Reserve Bank is saying it's good for the economy? Because he'd rather spend his time with so-called tests for Labor. He's got no plan for Australia. He's only got a plan for politics. That's how Scott Morrison rolls.
On asylum seekers, under what circumstances should someone who's failed to gain refugee status be granted a permanent visa?
I think, and as you know, I've previously held the portfolio. And I've previously been in a situation where I've exercised ministerial discretion. You don't only exercise ministerial discretion for issues of compassion, you also exercise ministerial discretion for issues of national interest. Simple example, when I was there, Fawad Ahmed, Australian cricketer, discretion was given for him to be able to become an Australian citizen. He was a citizen of Pakistan at the time. It wasn't viewed as a refugee case. It wasn't viewed as a compassionate case even, unless you want to look at the compassion of Australian cricket towards Australian cricket fans that we wanted him as a bowler. In the same way, you've got a national interest issue here. You've got a town that says this family is good for our town in Billawheeler. You've got a business that says I don't want to lose my employee. You don't even need to get to compassionate arguments before you have a national interest case. That's what there is
what I'm getting to there is, what's the standard then for Labor if an asylum seeker, they may have failed through all the court processes to be granted refugee status, but if they're accepted by the community, if they have kids, they settle in, should they be granted a permanent visa?
On any visa class. It doesn't have to be a refugee class, and that's the example I was trying to give. On any visa class, you'd think the Minister for Immigration would be able to act in the national interest. And, you know...
But what is that national interest as far as Labor's concerned? If you've settled in and got a job and had kids, even if you've failed to be granted a refugee visa, then you should be allowed to stay?
Well, no. I've explained. I can't explain it in terms other than how I have, David. I'm not trying to avoid the way you framed it. It's just
no. I'm just trying to get you. You're using the word national interest National interest.
Yeah,
what is the national interest here is what I'm trying to establish.
That's what and a town like Billawheeler, on every metric we've seen, it is good for them for this family to stay. I'm not sure how this family affects any part of the nation other than Billawheeler. But for Billawheeler, on every assessment we've seen, the employer, the community, the whole campaign that has been run out of there, I'm yet to see anyone say it is bad for Billawheeler. And if it's good for Billawheeler for this family to stay, how on earth is it anything other than in the national interest? That's where they're living, that's where they're working, that's where they're contributing.
So the standard, therefore, is if a town or perhaps a suburb says, we want this family to stay, they should stay.
No, the standard is if it's good for Australia. And in this particular example, no one has been able to put an argument that it was bad for Australia. And, you know, I just don't see why this government has so much trouble dealing with the national interest on this. It's pretty straightforward.
A final one, Tony Burke. The revelations at the ICAC hearing in the New South Wales branch of the Labor Party have been alarming. What sort of change do you think is needed to clean up the branch? Well,
obviously the change immediately happened following the evidence from Kayla Murnane that she had to leave that job, and that action was taken immediately and decisively. What we now need to look through, there's a whole lot of changes that have happened since that time 3 years ago, and we're going to need to work out how much has changed already and how much more needs to be done, because obviously the culture that was there when these events occurred some years ago is something that cannot be part of any modern political party. With that, though, the thing that I won't do is accept that we take lectures from Scott Morrison on this. You know, when he made his speech yesterday, New South Wales branch of the Liberal Party, he was a little bit silent over the fact that they lost 11 members of Parliament over donation corruption scandals with respect to developers. He was a little bit silent on the fact that their Victorian secretary ended up in jail. And he didn't want to go anywhere near the fact that the Liberal Party continued to take money from this exact same foreign donor even after they'd introduced legislation to the Parliament banning foreign donations. So, yes, New South Wales, I'm completely up on what needs to be done there, but I will not accept lectures from this bloke on that.
If the problem then goes across the aisle, do you agree with those who say we need to take the bold step of ending all donations in Australian politics?
Look, I've been on the side of wanting to pare them back radically for a very long time. Of course, as you'd know, back in the Hawke years, I think it was, we tried to do that. Channel 9 actually took us to court on a freedom of speech argument, and that was with respect to television advertising. So the extent to which we can pare it back, there's some limitations on, but every time this has come up in the Parliament, Labor has been on the side of paring it right back, and that's why with foreign donations, we banned them independently years before the Liberal Party had their own laws force them to do so. They introduced the laws and they thought they would take as much foreign money as they could until they were proclaimed. But the thing that you've raised is one of the issues that needs to be brought here. What people want is politics to be argued and won on the merits of arguments, not won by money, not won by lies.